The Bible tells us God is all-knowing, infinite, unchanging, sovereign over every corner of creation. From the highest heaven to the deepest sea, His word goes out and does not return void. His judgments are final. His decrees are eternal. So how do you explain the story of a woman who prayed, who wept, who refused to accept the verdict, and then found a way around it? Not one woman, several. Hidden across the pages of the Old Testament are stories of women who faced impossible situations, death, disgrace, the extinction of their bloodlines, the erasure of everything they had ever lived for. And in those moments of absolute desperation, when every door had been slammed shut and every road had been blocked, they did something that should have been unthinkable. They found a crack in the wall of divine judgment. They pushed their way through it, and they walked out the other side, not punished, not destroyed, but blessed. This is not a story about rebellion against God. It is not a story about clever sin going unpunished through some cosmic oversight. What you are about to discover is something far more profound, far more unsettling, and in the end, far more beautiful than either of those things. This is a story about the nature of God Himself, about what happens when human desperation collides with divine mercy in ways that not even the angels anticipated, about why God, who could have simply changed the outcome with a single word, instead chose to honor the women who refused to stop knocking on a door that appeared to be sealed forever. Leave us 777 inches. The comments, if you are ready to see the Bible in a way you have never seen it before. And make sure you like and subscribe, because what you are about to hear will change how you read Scripture for the rest of your life. We read the Bible looking for the obvious heroes. We look for Moses parting the sea. We look for David standing over Goliath. We look for Elijah calling down fire from heaven. These are the stories we know, the stories we tell our children, the stories that have been painted on cathedral ceilings and carved into the walls of ancient churches. But there is another layer of Scripture, hidden just beneath the surface, running like a river under the ground. And in that hidden layer are women whose names appear in passing, tucked between census numbers and land boundaries and genealogical lists that most readers skip entirely. Women who lived extraordinary lives and made impossible choices and changed the course of history, and who were given, in return, a single sentence, a half verse, a name without a story, until you look closer, until you slow down and ask, why is this name here? Why does this woman appear in this list? Why does the text, which usually rushes past women without pausing, suddenly stop and say her name? When you ask those questions, you begin to see what was always there. You begin to see that the Bible has been quietly, patiently, carefully preserving these stories for thousands of years, waiting for someone to finally pay attention. So let us pay attention now. Let us begin at the beginning. Let us meet the first woman who looked at the locked door of divine judgment and found a key hidden in plain sight. Her name is Tamar. To understand Tamar, you need to understand a law that sounds almost incomprehensible to modern ears. A law called levirate marriage. The word comes from the Latin word for brother-in-law, and the law itself was one of the most important social structures in the ancient world. The law was this: if a man died without leaving a son, his brother was obligated to marry the dead man's widow and produce an heir in his name. The child born from this union would inherit the dead man's estate, carry on his name, ensure that his family line did not disappear from the earth. It was not optional. It was not a favor. It was a sacred legal duty. Now, To our modern sensibilities, this sounds strange, perhaps even troubling, but you have to understand what the ancient world looked like for a woman without a son. There was no pension, there was no welfare system, there was no state apparatus to catch you when you fell. A widow without an heir had no claim on the family estate, no legal standing in the community, no protection from poverty or violence or exploitation. She was, in the most literal sense of the word, vulnerable in a way that is almost impossible to imagine from where we stand today. Levirate marriage was not about romance. It was not about preference. It was a safety net woven into the fabric of the law itself, ensuring that the most vulnerable women in society, those who had lost their husbands before producing an heir, would not be left to die alone and destitute. Tamar understood all of this. She had married a man named the firstborn son of Judah, and Judah was no minor figure. He was one of the 12 sons of Jacob, one of the patriarchs of what would become the 12 tribes of Israel. To marry Judah's firstborn was to marry into one of the most important families in the ancient world, a family that stood at the very center of God's unfolding covenant with humanity. And then died. The Bible tells us the reason with startling brevity. Was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. No elaboration, no explanation of what the wickedness was, just the blunt, devastating fact. He was wicked, and then he was gone. Can you feel the weight of that moment for Tamar? She was a young woman, probably very young by our standards, thrust suddenly into widowhood in a world where widowhood meant the beginning of a slow slide toward invisibility. Her future, which had seemed so certain when she married into Judah's family, had evaporated in an instant, but the law still protected her. Judah had another son. His name was Onan, and according to the law of levirate marriage, Onan was now obligated to take Tamar as his wife and give her the son that would secure her future. What happened next is one of the darkest passages in the book of Genesis. Onan knew that any child he fathered with Tamar would not count as his own heir. He knew that this child would inherit in his dead brother's name, which meant a portion of the family estate that might otherwise come to Onan would go to someone else. So Onan made a calculated, deliberate, deeply selfish decision. He went through the motions of the obligation. He married Tamar. He slept with her. But every time, he pulled away at the crucial moment, spilling his seed on the ground, going through the ritual performance of the duty, while systematically ensuring it could never be fulfilled. The Lord was displeased with Onan, and Onan died. 2 husbands, both dead. Tamar was now twice a widow, still childless, still unprotected, her future more precarious than ever. And Judah had one more son, a boy named Shelah. According to the law, according to everything that was sacred and obligatory in their culture, Shelah was next. He was Tamar's last hope. But Judah was afraid. 2 of his sons had died, married to this woman. Whether he genuinely believed Tamar was cursed, whether he was simply numb with grief and not thinking clearly, or whether somewhere deep inside him, he understood that both his sons had brought their deaths upon themselves through their own wickedness. The text does not say with certainty. What the text does say, with quiet clarity, is that Judah had no intention of giving Shelah to Tamar. He told her to go back to her father's house. He told her to wait there as a widow until Shelah was old enough to marry. It sounded like a promise. It was not a promise. It was a way of getting rid of a problem without having to confront it directly. Tamar went. She waited. She watched Shelah grow up, and Shelah was not given to her. Years passed. Judah's own wife died. He mourned. The seasons changed. Sheila became a grown man, and still no word came from Judah. No messenger, no formal betrothal, nothing. Can you feel the slow horror of that realization settling over Tamar? She had done everything right. She had been patient. She had obeyed. She had gone to her father's house and waited, as she had been told to wait. And now she understood, with a terrible clarity, that she had been forgotten, that she had been set aside, that the promise that had been made to her was never going to be kept. She had no legal recourse. She could not go to a court of law and demand that Judah fulfill his obligation, not in any practical sense. She could not find another husband while Sheila was alive and theoretically still obligated to her. She was trapped in a legal limbo that had no exit, bound to a promise that the man who made it had quietly decided to abandon. So Tamar made a decision, and the decision she made was breathtaking in its audacity, its desperation, and its theological complexity. She heard that Judah was going to Timnah to oversee the shearing of his sheep. She took off her widow's clothes, the garments that identified her as unavailable, as belonging to a dead man's household, and she put on a veil, and she sat down at the entrance to Enaim, on the road to Timnah, where she knew Judah would pass. The veil was significant. In that culture, in that context, a veiled woman sitting alone at the side of a road had a very specific meaning. Judah saw her. He did not know who she was. He assumed she was a prostitute, and he went to her. Now here is where the genius of Tamar reveals itself. Before she agreed to anything, she asked for a pledge. She asked Judah to leave something with her as a guarantee that he would send payment later. And what did Judah leave? His seal, his cord, his staff. These were not trivial items. In the ancient world, a man's seal was the equivalent of his signature, his identity, his legal authority. It was the instrument he used to mark documents and transactions as his own. To possess a man's seal was to possess proof of who he was, undeniable, incontestable proof. Tamar took the seal, the cord, and the staff, and then she disappeared. When Judah sent a messenger to find the woman and retrieve his pledge, there was no woman to be found. The people of the area said there had never been a shrine prostitute at that place. Judah was embarrassed but let the matter go. Better to lose the pledge than to be made a laughingstock. 3 months later, Judah received news that stopped his heart. Tamar was pregnant, and since she was legally bound to his household, since she bore the status of a woman promised to his son Shelah, this pregnancy was a scandal of the highest order. In the eyes of the law, in the eyes of the community, Tamar had committed adultery. She had shamed the family. She had violated the sanctity of the levirate obligation. Judah's response was immediate and devastating. "Bring her out," he said. "Let her be burned." This was not exile. This was not disgrace. This was a death sentence, the most severe punishment available. And Judah, the patriarch, the man with the authority, had pronounced it. Now watch what Tamar did. She did not beg. She did not weep. She did not throw herself on Judah's mercy and appeal to his compassion. She sent a message, quiet and precise, and utterly devastating in its simplicity. She sent the seal, the cord, the staff. She sent them with a single sentence. "The man who owns these things is the one who made me pregnant." And then she said something that reveals the true depth of her character, the true nature of what she had done. She said, "Please examine these and see whose seal and cord and staff these are." Not an accusation, not a triumph, an invitation to recognize the truth, the silence that must have fallen when Judah received those items. Can you imagine it? The moment of recognition, the moment when everything he had done, all the way back to the death of Er, all the way through Onan's selfishness, all the way through his own broken promise to Tamar, came into focus with terrible clarity. And then Judah said something that changed everything. She is more righteous than I. 4 words in the original Hebrew. 4 words that are among the most extraordinary in the entire Old Testament. She is more righteous than I. Not, she has been caught. Not, she has shamed me. Not, she will be punished despite the circumstances. He looked at what Tamar had done, understood why she had done it, measured her actions against his own, and pronounced a verdict that reversed everything. She was more righteous than he was, because she had fought for the justice that was owed to her, using the only tools available to her in a world that had closed every other door. And he had failed in his duty, failed in his obligation, broken the law that was supposed to protect her, and then tried to punish her for the consequences of his own failure. Tamar was not burned. She gave birth to twins, Perez and Zerah, and Perez, the firstborn of those twins, the child whose very existence was the result of Tamar's refusal to accept an unjust verdict, became an ancestor of King David, and through David's line, an ancestor of Jesus Christ. The woman who outsmarted the patriarch of Judah's household is in the bloodline of the Messiah. Does that not take your breath away? Now you might be asking a question that is entirely fair, entirely reasonable, and in fact theologically essential. Was what Tamar did right? Was it moral? Was it something God approved of? This is a question that has occupied rabbis and theologians for thousands of years, and the answers are more nuanced than they first appear. What Tamar did was technically deceptive. She disguised herself. She withheld her identity. She used Judah's own weakness against him. By almost any straightforward moral code, the method she chose was not admirable. But the goal was not sin. The goal was justice. Tamar was not trying to bring down Judah. She was not trying to humiliate him, or destroy him, or steal from him. She was trying to obtain the one thing she was legally and morally owed an heir, a future, a place in the world that would not leave her to die alone and forgotten. She was claiming what was hers, and the most remarkable thing is that the text does not condemn her. The text does not come with a divine narrator's voice, saying, "And this was displeasing to the Lord." It comes instead with Judah's own voice saying, "She is more righteous than I." The rabbinical tradition has wrestled with this for centuries. The Talmud discusses Tamar's actions at length, and the general conclusion is striking. What Tamar did was not a sin to be forgiven. It was a demonstration of righteousness under extraordinary circumstances. She used the only tools available to her to enforce a law that was being violated, and she did so without violence, without cruelty, without anything other than her own courage and her own intelligence. God did not strike her down. God did not rebuke her. God gave her twins and placed one of those twins in the direct line of the Messiah. That is not the response of a God who was outsmarted against his will. That is the response of a God who was watching, who understood, and who honored what he saw. But Tamar is not the only one, not even close. Let us travel forward in time, through the wilderness years, through the conquest of Canaan, to a city with walls so thick that houses were built into the walls themselves, a city whose name has become synonymous with the most dramatic military miracle in the history of Israel, Jericho. And in that city, in a house built into the very wall, lived a woman the Bible describes with startling directness as a prostitute. Her name was Rahab, and what Rahab did was, in its own way, just as extraordinary as what Tamar did. Perhaps more so, because Tamar acted to save herself. Rahab acted to save an entire people she did not belong to on the basis of a faith she had only recently come to possess. The story begins with two spies. Joshua, preparing to lead the Israelites across the Jordan and into Canaan, sent two men ahead as scouts. They were to survey the land, assess the defenses, bring back intelligence that would help determine the strategy for the invasion. These were trained men, men accustomed to operating in hostile territory, and somehow, within hours of arriving in Jericho, they ended up at the house of Rahab. Was it coincidence? Was it divine providence? The text doesn't explain how they came to be there. It simply tells us that they were there, and that the king of Jericho found out about it almost immediately. Word came to the king. There are Israelite spies in the city, and they are at Rahab's house. The king sent men to Rahab with a command: bring out the men who came to you. And Rahab made a choice. She had hidden the spies on the roof of her house, beneath stalks of flax. When the king's men came, she looked them in the eye and told them the men had been there, yes, but they had already left. If the king's men hurried, they might be able to catch them before they crossed the river. The king's men left. The gates of the city were shut behind them, and the spies were still on Rahab's roof, listening to the sound of their pursuers' footsteps fading into the distance. Now think about what Rahab had just done. She had committed treason in the eyes of Jericho, in the eyes of her own people and her own king. She had harbored enemy spies, lied to the king's officers, and actively helped the enemies of her city escape. If she had been caught, the punishment would have been death, not just for her, potentially for her entire family. Why did she do it? She told the spies herself, and her explanation is one of the most remarkable statements of faith in the entire Old Testament. She told them that the terror of Israel had fallen on all of Canaan, that the people of Jericho had heard what God had done at the Red Sea, how the waters had parted before Israel and the Egyptian army had been drowned. They had heard about the defeat of the Amorite kings east of the Jordan. And she said, our hearts melted and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on the earth below. Read those words again. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on the earth below. This was not the confession of a woman who had grown up hearing the Torah read in the synagogue. This was not someone who had been raised in the covenant community, shaped by generations of Israelite faith. This was a Canaanite woman, a prostitute, someone who by every social marker of her world stood at the margins of respectability, someone whose life had not been shaped by the stories of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And yet she had looked at the evidence, the miracles, the victories, the undeniable presence of something supernatural moving with the people of Israel, and she had drawn the only conclusion that made theological sense. The God of Israel was the real God, the only God, God in heaven above and on the earth below. And because she believed that, she made a deal. I have shown kindness to you, she told the spies. Now swear to me that you will show kindness to my family. When you come to take this city, spare my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them. Save us from death. The spies agreed. They gave her a crimson cord and told her to tie it in the window of her house. When the Israelites came, any member of her household who was inside the house with the crimson cord in the window would be spared. But she must keep silent. She must tell no one. She lowered the spies down the city wall by a rope through her window. Her house, remember, was built into the wall itself and sent them on their way. And then she tied the crimson cord in the window and waited. She waited while the Israelite army marched around the city once a day for 6 days. She waited while the priests blew their trumpets and the army marched in silence. She waited on the seventh day when they marched around the city 7 times, and then she heard it to the long blast of the trumpet and the shout of the entire army rising into the air. And the walls of Jericho fell. Every wall. The Bible says the wall fell flat, and every man charged straight in. The city was taken, and everything in it was devoted to destruction. Everything except the house with the crimson cord in the window. Joshua had commanded that Rahab and her household be brought out safely, exactly as the spies had promised. And so while Jericho burned, while an entire city was reduced to ash and rubble and silence, one family walked out alive. A Canaanite woman, a prostitute, someone who should have had no claim on the mercy of Israel's God by any conventional understanding of covenant theology, walked out of the ruins of her city, holding the hand of her family. And Rahab did not merely survive, she was grafted into Israel. She married a man named Salmon. She became a mother in Israel, and her son was Boaz. If that name means nothing to you yet, wait, because Boaz is at the center of the next story we need to tell. And his mother Rahab, the Canaanite prostitute who hid 2 spies on her roof and tied a crimson cord in her window, is listed in the genealogy of Jesus in the first chapter of Matthew. There she is, right alongside Tamar, in the bloodline of the Messiah, the woman who committed treason against her own city on the basis of a faith she had only just discovered, is in the direct line that leads to the Son of God. There is a question we have to stop and ask at this point, because it is too important to skip over. Both Tamar and Rahab were women who broke rules. Tamar deceived her father-in-law. Rahab committed treason and lied to the king's officers. Both of them did things that, taken in isolation, look like clear violations of conventional morality. And yet both of them are honored by the text. Both of them are placed in the genealogy of Jesus. Both of them are cited in the New Testament as examples of faith and righteousness. In the 11th chapter of Hebrews, often called the Great Hall of Faith, the chapter that lists the heroes of the Old Testament whose faith moved mountains and parted seas, there is Rahab. By faith, Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient, because she had given a friendly welcome to the spies. By faith, Rahab is a hero of faith. In the book of James, the same Rahab is used as an illustration of the truth that faith without works is dead. Was not Rahab the prostitute justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out by another way? Justified by works. Rahab is held up as an example of genuine active faith that produces real-world action. How do we make sense of this? The answer, I believe, lies in a distinction that runs through the entire Bible, but is rarely articulated clearly. It is the distinction between the letter of a moral law and the spirit of a moral law, between rules that were designed to protect the weak and the same rules being used to crush the weak, between justice as a system and justice as a living reality. Tamar was not trying to break the law of God. She was trying to enforce it against the man who was supposed to be enforcing it and had instead abandoned it. She used unorthodox means because orthodox means had been denied to her, and God looked at the heart behind the action and saw not deception but desperation, not sin but survival, not wickedness, but a woman willing to risk everything for justice. Rahab was not betraying something worth being loyal to. She was choosing the truth over the lie, the real God over the false gods of Canaan, the living covenant over the dying city. Her treason was not betrayal, it was conversion. It was the most radical act of faith available to her in that moment, and she performed it with total commitment and total courage. God does not honor the letter of the law above the spirit that gave the law its meaning. He never has. He never will. And the women who understood this, who grasped instinctively that mercy and justice and covenant love were the heart of what God was doing in the world, those women changed history. We are not finished yet, not even close, because the most famous story of a woman who refused to accept the verdict, who found a way through the locked door, who bent the rules of her world with breathtaking courage and changed the fate of an entire people. That story is still ahead of us. Her name is Esther, and her story is, in some ways, the most dramatic of all, because unlike Tamar, who was fighting for her own future, and unlike Rahab, who was fighting for her own family, Esther was fighting for the survival of an entire nation. And the door she pushed her way through was the door to the throne room of the most powerful man in the world, a man who had the legal authority, with a single gesture, to have her put to death for simply entering his presence uninvited. To understand what Esther did, you have to understand the world she lived in. The Persian Empire under King Ahasuerus, also known as Xerxes, was the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen. It stretched from India to Ethiopia, encompassing 127 provinces and populations that would be staggering even by modern standards. And at its center was the king, whose power was so absolute, so total, so unquestioned, that there was a law protecting him from the approach of the uninvited. The law was this: any person who came into the inner court of the palace without being summoned was to be put to death. No exceptions, no appeals, no mercy. The only protection was the king's mercy. If he extended his golden scepter, your life was spared. If he did not, you died where you stood. This was the law that Esther had to walk through to save her people. How did she come to be in this position? The story begins with a queen who refused to perform for the pleasure of a drunken king. Ahasuerus had been holding a banquet for the nobles and officials of his empire, a display of wealth and power that lasted for 180 days. On the seventh day, drunk with wine, the king commanded that Queen Vashti be brought out wearing her royal crown so that he could display her beauty to his guests. Vashti refused. The king was furious, and his advisers were alarmed. If the queen had refused the king's command, what would happen to the authority of husbands throughout the empire? A message had to be sent. Vashti was stripped of her queenship and banished. A search was conducted across the empire for a new queen. Beautiful young women were brought to the palace, prepared and presented to the king, and from among them the king would choose. One of those young women was Esther. She was a Jewish orphan, raised by her older cousin Mordecai after the death of her parents. Her Jewish name was Hadassah, but she was known by her Persian name, Esther, which may come from the Persian word for star, or may be related to the name of the Babylonian goddess Ishtar. She was beautiful, and she had a quality that the text describes with a word that could be translated as kindness or grace, or favor, something in her manner and her presence that made everyone who met her well disposed toward her. Esther won the favor of the eunuch who oversaw the women's quarters. She won the favor of everyone who saw her. and when she was brought before the king, she won his favor above all others. He placed the crown on her head and made her queen, but Mordecai had told her to keep her Jewish identity secret. He had given her careful, specific instruction: do not reveal your people or your family, and Esther obeyed. The conflict in the story erupts through a man named Haman. He was an Agagite, which the careful reader of the Bible will recognize as a detail laden with ancient significance. The Agagites were the royal house of the Amalekites, the people who had been the enemies of Israel since the days of Moses. Haman had risen to become the second most powerful man in the Persian Empire, and the king had commanded that all officials bow down to him. Mordecai refused. Day after day, the other officials bowed when Haman passed. Day after day, Mordecai stood. Why? Because Mordecai was a Jew, and bowing down before a man the way one would bow before a deity was a violation of everything his faith stood for. He would not do it. Haman was enraged. But punishing one man felt insufficient for an ego the size of Haman's. He wanted something larger, something total. He went to the king and proposed a solution to what he described as a problem throughout the empire. There was a people scattered among all the provinces whose customs were different from all other peoples, who did not keep the king's laws, and who therefore should not be tolerated. He did not name the Jews. He only described them, and the king, without asking questions, without demanding to know who these people were, gave Haman his signet ring and told him to do with the people as it seemed good to him. With the king's ring in his possession, Haman sent dispatches to every province of the empire. On the 13th day of the 12th month, every Jew in the empire, man, woman, child, was to be killed. Their property was to be plundered. An entire people, an entire civilization was to be erased from the earth in a single day. Mordecai put on sackcloth and ashes, the ancient sign of mourning and lamentation, and he sat at the king's gate and wept with a loud and bitter cry. Throughout every province, wherever the king's command reached, the Jewish people mourned and fasted and wept, and Mordecai sent a message to Esther. He told her what had happened. He sent her a copy of the decree. He told her to go to the king, to plead for mercy, to beg for the lives of her people, and Esther sent back a message that revealed the true dimensions of the trap she was in. She told him, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king in the inner court without being called, there is but one law: all alike are to be put to death, except the one to whom the king extends the golden scepter, that he may live. But as for me, I have not been called to come to the king these 30 days. 30 days. The king had not summoned her in 30 days. She had no way of knowing if she would receive the scepter or the executioner. She had no way of knowing what mood the king was in, whether he was favorably disposed toward her, whether some court intrigue had turned him against her. Without her knowledge, she could walk into the throne room and die. Mordecai's response to her message is one of the most quoted passages in the entire book of Esther, and one of the most theologically rich statements in the Old Testament. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? For such a time as this. The implication is staggering. What if everything that had happened to Esther, the death of her parents, her adoption by Mordecai, her beauty, her selection as queen, the particular moment in history she occupied. What if none of it was coincidence? What if she had been placed with extraordinary precision exactly where she needed to be, at exactly the moment when she was needed? Esther received that message and was silent for a moment that must have felt like a lifetime, and then she sent her reply. Go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. If I perish, I perish. 5 words in the original Hebrew, 5 words that carry the weight of a decision to walk directly into the possibility of death for the sake of something greater than yourself. Not bravado, not recklessness, a clear-eyed, fully conscious choice. I know I might die, and I am going anyway. After 3 days of fasting, Esther put on her royal robes. She stood in the inner court of the palace, in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne. When the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight, and he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. She had walked through the door. What she did next was as strategically brilliant as her courage was profound. She did not immediately reveal the plot. She did not throw herself on the king's mercy with a desperate speech about Haman and the decree and the fate of her people. She invited the king and Haman to a banquet. At that banquet, she invited them to a second banquet. She built expectation. She created intimacy. She drew the king closer and closer to the moment of revelation. And Haman, in the meantime, built a gallows 75 feet high, intending to hang Mordecai. The night before the second banquet, the king could not sleep. He had his servants read to him from the royal chronicles the record of everything that had happened during his reign, and they read to him about the day that Mordecai had uncovered and reported a plot to assassinate the king. Saving his life, the king asked, "What honor or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" "Nothing," the servants said. The next morning, Haman arrived at the palace to ask the king's permission to hang Mordecai. Before he could speak, the king called him in and asked him a question. What should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor? Haman, assuming the king meant to honor him, gave an answer of breathtaking pomposity. Bring royal robes the king himself has worn. Bring a horse the king himself has ridden. Let a noble prince lead this man through the city square and proclaim, "This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor." The king said, "Go at once, take the robes and the horse, and do just as you have said to Mordecai the Jew. Leave out nothing you have mentioned." Haman led Mordecai through the city square, proclaiming the king's honor, and then ran home in shame and grief and a dawning horror. That evening, at the second banquet, Esther finally revealed everything. The king asked her, "What is your wish, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you. What is your request? Even to half of my kingdom, it shall be fulfilled." And Esther said, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted me for my wish, and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated." The king demanded to know who had done this, who would presume to do such a thing. And Esther said, "A foe and an enemy, this wicked Haman." The king's rage was immediate and total. He walked out into the palace garden to compose himself. Haman threw himself on the couch where Esther was reclining to beg for his life. The king came back in and saw what looked like Haman assaulting the queen. Haman was taken out and hanged on the very gallows he had built for Mordecai. But the decree could not simply be withdrawn. Under Persian law, a royal decree sealed with the king's ring could not be revoked. This was the locked door that remained even after Haman was dead. An empire-wide order for the destruction of the Jewish people, signed with the king's own signet, irrevocable under the laws of the Medes and Persians. So Esther went to the king again. Again she entered without being summoned. Again she knelt at his feet, and again he extended the golden scepter, and she asked, if it please the king, let the order of Haman be revoked. The king could not revoke it, but he did the next best thing. He allowed Esther and Mordecai to write a new decree in the king's name, sealed with the king's ring, giving the Jewish people in every province the right to assemble and defend themselves against anyone who might attack them. The Jewish people could fight back. On the day that had been decreed for their destruction, the Jewish people across the empire assembled and defeated those who came against them. They survived. They did not merely survive, they prevailed. And the Feast of Purim was established, celebrated by Jewish people to this day, in memory of the days when they gained relief from their enemies, when their mourning was turned into rejoicing and their grief into a holiday, because a young woman who had been an orphan, who had been taken into captivity, who had been brought to a foreign palace and crowned a foreign queen, because that woman had decided, in the moment of maximum danger, that the life of her people was worth the risk of her own. If I perish, I perish. 3 women, 3 stories, 3 impossible situations that should have ended in death or erasure, or the silent disappearance of an entire people from the pages of history. Tamar, who had been denied the justice the law promised her, and who found a way to demand it using nothing but her own courage and the evidence of Judah's own failure. Rahab, who looked at the God of Israel and recognized the truth and bet everything she had on that recognition, and walked out of the ruins of Jericho holding the hand of her family. Esther, who walked into the throne room of the most powerful man in the world, knowing she might die for it, and who used the 3 days she spent fasting to build a courage that did not bend, that did not break, that stood firm in the moment when everything hung in the balance. What do these 3 women have in common? They were all, by the standards of their world, powerless. Tamar had no husband, no son, no future. Rahab had no covenant connection to the God she was betting everything on. Esther was a captive, an orphan, a woman in a world where the decree of a king was the closest thing to the word of God. None of them had the power to change their situations through conventional means. The systems they lived within were not designed to give them what they needed. The doors were locked, the paths were blocked, and every single one of them found a way through anyway, not by compromising on what mattered most, not by abandoning their integrity or their faith or their loyalty to the people they loved, but by seeing with extraordinary clarity what the situation actually required, and then doing exactly that, regardless of the cost. This is what it means to be more righteous than the system. This is what it means to understand that the spirit of the law matters more than its letter. This is what it means to have the kind of faith that is not passive, not resigned, not willing to accept that the story ends here, in this darkened room, with this closed door. The faith that outsmarted the verdict was not the absence of fear. Esther was afraid. Tamar was afraid. Rahab was afraid. Every single one of them had everything to lose. The faith that outsmarted the verdict was the decision to act anyway. Now, there is one more woman we must consider before we close, and she is perhaps the most theologically significant of all, because what she did was not merely clever. What she did was pray. She prayed with a desperation that made the priest watching her think she was drunk. She prayed with a grief so raw and so deep that the words barely came out, that her lips moved but no sound emerged, that her whole body shook with the weight of what she was bringing before God. Her name was Hannah. She was the wife of a man named Elkanah, and she was barren. In the ancient world, barrenness was not merely a personal sorrow, it was a social catastrophe, a spiritual question mark, a mark that the world around you would interpret as the sign of divine disfavor. Hannah carried this weight year after year. Elkanah had another wife, Peninnah, who had children, and who tormented Hannah about her barrenness with a deliberate cruelty that the text records with quiet, devastating clarity. Year after year, when the family went up to the tabernacle to worship, Peninnah would provoke Hannah until she wept and could not eat. Year after year, Elkanah would try to comfort her. Am I not worth more to you than 10 sons? And Hannah would weep, and the emptiness would remain. One year, after they had eaten and drunk at Shiloh, Hannah rose up and went to the tabernacle, and she prayed. The Hebrew word used to describe how she prayed is unusual. She prayed in bitterness of soul. She wept much. She made a vow, a specific, unconditional, irrevocable vow. Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your servant, and remember me, and not forget your servant, but will give your servant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life. If you give me a son, I will give him back to you. Eli the priest saw her lips moving without sound. He assumed she was drunk and rebuked her. Hannah answered him with a dignity that silences the room. I am a woman troubled in spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have been pouring out my soul before the Lord. Do not regard your servant as a worthless woman, for all along I have been speaking out of my great anxiety and vexation. Eli recognized what he had misread, and he blessed her. He said, Go in peace, and the God of Israel grant your petition that you have made to him. And the Bible records something remarkable about what happened next. Hannah went her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad. The prayer had not yet been answered. The child had not yet been given. She was leaving the tabernacle the same person who had walked in a barren woman, the object of her rival's contempt, a person whose sorrow had not yet been resolved by any external change in circumstances. But something had shifted. Something had moved. She had brought everything she had, everything she was, everything she hoped and feared and longed for, and laid it down before God with a totality and a completeness that had no reservation in it, no self-protection, no holding back. And in the act of that total release, something settled. She ate. Her face was no longer sad, and in due time, God remembered Hannah. She conceived and bore a son, and she named him Samuel, which sounds like the Hebrew for heard by God, because, she said, I have asked for him from the Lord. And then she did the thing she had promised. When Samuel was weaned, she brought him to the tabernacle. She brought him to Eli, and she gave him back. This is what I prayed for, she said. The Lord has granted me my petition that I made to him. Therefore I have lent him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he is lent to the Lord. Hannah walked away from the tabernacle without her son. Samuel grew up in the service of the Lord. He became the last and greatest of the judges of Israel. He anointed Saul as the first king of Israel. He anointed David as the second. He was the hinge point of Israelite history, the figure who stood between one era and the next, the voice that God used to speak to a nation at the moment when everything was changing. And he began as a prayer prayed in bitterness of soul, with lips that moved but no sound came out, in a grief so deep that a watching priest thought the woman was drunk. Hannah did not outsmart God with cleverness, the way Tamar did. She did not outsmart the system with courage, the way Esther did. She outsmarted the silence with a prayer that refused to be polished or presentable or contained within the bounds of what was socially appropriate. A prayer that poured out everything, that held nothing back, that made a vow the world would have called reckless. And God heard her. God always hears that kind of prayer, not because it follows the right formula, not because it uses the correct theological vocabulary, but because it is real, because it comes from the deepest place in the human heart, the place where we stop performing and stop managing and stop trying to keep our grief within acceptable limits, and we simply let it out before the one who can actually do something about it. So, what are we to make of all this? What does it mean that these women, a deceived widow who committed what looked like prostitution to claim her rights, a Canaanite prostitute who committed treason to protect enemy spies, a captive orphan who walked uninvited into a throne room to prevent a genocide, a barren woman who wept so violently that a priest thought she was drunk? What does it mean that these are the women in the genealogy of Jesus, in the Hall of Faith in Hebrews, in the stories that the New Testament reaches back to as examples of what it looks like to truly believe? It means that God is not looking for perfect circumstances. He is not waiting for us to approach Him through the proper channels, with our lives in order and our prayers well composed and our courage fully assembled before we begin. He is looking for what He found in Tamar, the refusal to accept injustice when the law itself demands justice. He is looking for what He found in Rahab, the recognition of truth and the willingness to bet everything on it. He is looking for what He found in Esther, the courage to step into the space between where you are and where you are needed, even when that space is filled with danger. He is looking for what He found in Hannah, the honesty to bring Him the full weight of your sorrow and your longing, with nothing held back and nothing performed. These women did not outsmart God. God found Him in the place where desperation meets courage, where grief meets prayer, where the system fails and a person stands up anyway and says, "This is not how the story ends." And God said, "You are more righteous than I." No, He did not say that. Judah said that about Tamar, but in saying it, Judah was giving voice to something deeper. He was recognizing that righteousness is not always found in the expected place, in the expected form, delivered by the expected people through the expected channels. Sometimes righteousness looks like a woman with a veil on the side of a road, holding a seal and a cord and a staff. Sometimes it looks like a scarlet thread hanging from a window in a doomed city's wall. Sometimes it looks like a queen in royal robes standing in a doorway where she has no legal right to stand. Sometimes it looks like lips moving in silence in a dark corner of a tabernacle, pouring out a grief too deep for words. And every time, God sees it. Every time, He recognizes it. Every time, He honors it. The door that appeared to be locked was never really locked at all. It was always open to the one who was willing to knock hard enough long enough, honestly enough, and courageously enough to find out. If you are standing in front of a door right now that seems impossible to open, I want you to remember these women. I want you to remember Tamar, who did not accept that her story was over. I want you to remember Rahab, who recognized the truth and acted on it before anyone asked her to. I want you to remember Esther, who said, "If I perish," and walked in anyway. I want you to remember Hannah, who prayed until something inside her shifted, even before the answer came. And I want you to ask yourself the question that Mordecai asked Esther on the day that everything hung in the balance. Who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Maybe the story you are living is not the tragedy it looks like from where you are standing. Maybe the closed door is not the end. Maybe you have been placed with extraordinary precision exactly where you need to be at exactly the moment when what you are and what you carry is precisely what the world needs. Maybe it is time to knock. If this video moved you, if it gave you something to think about, I want you to share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Tell me which of these women speaks to you most. And if you have not yet subscribed to Voices from Scripture, this is the moment. There are more stories like this one, more hidden depths in the pages of the Bible, more women and men who changed history in ways that the casual reader never notices. God's word is deeper than we know. Every time we look, there is more, and the search itself is the gift.